So this is my last video on India's 20th century, and it's going to cover Indian history from independence to the turn of the century. Okay, so my last video ends with British rule coming to an end, and India and Pakistan being declared independent states. There were a fair few early issues with partition and Kashmir, and let's just say these countries did not get off to the best start. So Jawaharlal Nehru becomes the first Prime Minister of India, and in 1947 the country had a lot of problems to fix. To list a few, only around 14% of the population could read and write, India was still heavily reliant on food imports, and long-standing inequality was still a major issue. But Nehru was always an idealist, and he believed that under his guidance, India will undergo a rapid social and economic transformation. If you've ever heard of socialism, well, Nehru and the Congress Party were a big fan of the stuff. He introduced Soviet-style 5-year plans, and he thought that the best chance India has to modernize is to start nationalizing industry and for the government to take an active role in all government sectors. Nehru initiated the nationalization of Indian railways and steel, and his successors would take his policies forward even more. But India also wanted to hold the title as the world's largest democracy, and the first elections in 1951 was at this point the largest experiment with democracy in history, with 173 million voters. A lot of post-colonial states can't say this, but since independence, India has had regular and free elections, apart from a small blip in the 1970s, but we'll get to that. Then we have foreign policy under Nehru, which is also really interesting. So you probably know that after World War II, a little thing called the Cold War was starting. The world was split into two hostile blocs, one led by the Soviet Union, who championed communism, and one led by the USA, which championed capitalism. But Nehru believed that the newly independent countries of Africa and Asia have nothing to gain from joining these power blocs, and their needs lie in combating poverty and colonialism. Nehru was instrumental in organising the Bandung Conference of 1955, and this led to the basis of the non-aligned movement, which proposed that countries should abstain itself from allying itself with one of the two superpowers, and instead join together to promote national self-determination and anti-imperial movements around the world. The cool thing about non-alignment is that you can develop ties with countries on both sides of the divide. For example, the Soviets give you tanks, the Americans give you grain. The Americans give you technology, and the Soviets give you weaponry. It's kind of like two divorced parents fighting for their child's approval. However, eventually, Pakistan would become close allies with the US, and India would start to lean towards the Soviet Union. Anyway, to the north of India, you have China. A few years after India won independence, Mao Zedong and the Communist Party won the Chinese Civil War, and there was a big question about the relationship between the two largest powers in Asia. At first, things went pretty well. India is one of the first countries to recognize the People's Republic of China, and they had agreed on the 5 principles of peaceful cooperation in 1954. But when China annexed Tibet, it brought the countries in direct contact with each other, and then China starts to dispute its border territories of India. Eventually, India gave refuge to the Tibetan government in exile and the Dalai Lama, and things started to escalate on the border with China. Finally, in 1962, China launched a massive preemptive strike into Aksai Chin and the NEFA, completely catching India off guard, and before the Indian army could prepare for a full-scale war, China declared a unilateral ceasefire and withdrew. In the aftermath of the Sino-Indian War, the Indian army was completely humiliated, and Nehru's career never really recovered from the betrayal from the north. Nehru died a few years later in 1964, after guiding the country for nearly 2 decades after independence. Lal Bahadur Shastri comes into office, and although he wasn't there for long, his rule was definitely eventful. Across the border in Pakistan, General Ayub Khan and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto hoped to take advantage of a politically and militarily weak India, and in 1965 went to war again. The Pakistani military sent troops to occupy the disputed Rann of Kutch region in Gujarat, and then sent hundreds of thousands more into Kashmir. Indian forces then counterattacked and crossed the border, and came dangerously close to Lahore. Both sides agreed to a ceasefire, and after the humiliation against China, the Indian army had restored some pride and prestige. But during the peace negotiations in Tashkent, Shastri died of a heart attack in 1966. In comes Indira Gandhi, and no, she's not related to Mahatma Gandhi. There'll be no examples of nepotism in Indian politics. Just kidding, she's actually Nehru's daughter. Collectively, Nehru and Indira Gandhi ruled modern India for nearly 32 years. When Indira came in, she needed to address India's rapidly growing population, so she pushed for the green revolution of agriculture, as India went from a food-deficient country to one of the world's largest producers of wheat and rice, A pretty notable achievement, and for the first time since independence, India became self-sufficient in food production. But just like her father, Indira was also a big fan of socialism and wanted some more radical reforms and started nationalising India's largest banks, its insurance industries, and rapidly implemented land reforms. She had a deep affinity for the poor and marginalised in India, and she actually ran for the 1971 election with the slogan, "Remove poverty, save the country." She won this election in a landslide, but on the day that she was sworn in, a new crisis started to emerge in East Pakistan. Alright, so after independence, Pakistan was created, but was split into two parts, an eastern wing and a western wing, and about 1,000 miles of a hostile India in between them. Despite East Pakistan only making up about a sixth of Pakistan territory, it made up over half the country's population, and a few problems stood out. For example, in East Pakistan, the vast majority of people spoke Bengali, but Urdu was imposed as the official language of the nation, leading to language riots in the 1950s. Also, Pakistan had a bit of a history with military dictators, and so with these leaders, they made sure that all political and economic power was concentrated in the West Wing. Pakistan had its first free general elections in 1970, and to many people's surprise, the Awami League led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman in East Pakistan won by an absolute landslide, taking 99% of the seats in the east. Fearing a shift of power to East Pakistan, a military crackdown was launched, and during Operation Searchlight, hundreds of thousands of Bengalis, possibly even millions, were massacred. Bangladesh proclaimed its independence from Pakistan in March 1971, and thus the Bangladesh Liberation War had begun. Around 10 million refugees fled to India, creating a humanitarian crisis. But Indira Gandhi remained cool and collected. Of course, India wanted to stick it to Pakistan wherever it can, and so India gave sanctuary to the Bangladesh government in exile, and the Indian army helped to arm and train the Bangladeshi freedom fighters, the Mukti Bahini. To prevent US and Chinese intervention in the war, India signed a treaty of peace, friendship, and cooperation with the Soviet Union and temporarily abandoned non-alignment. Finally, on the 4th of December 1971, Indira Gandhi sent in the Indian army into East Pakistan, marking the beginning of the Third Indo-Pakistani War. The Indian army quickly overran the country within 11 days and took the capital Dhaka. The Pakistani army surrendered, and Bangladesh became an independent country. Indira Gandhi's leadership and toughness came out really well from the crisis, and she became incredibly popular with the people. But within only a few years, this popularity would completely unravel. Okay, so in the 1970s, the Indian economy faced some real challenges. It was hit really hard by the global oil crisis, and inflation and food shortages led to massive strikes in Gujarat and Bihar, and law and order completely broke down. To make matters worse, the Allahabad High Court ruled that Indira engaged in electoral malpractice in the 1971 elections. Mrs. Gandhi was expected to resign from office. Well, that didn't happen, and instead, Indira declared a state of emergency in 1975 and suspended all civil and political rights. Within the next few months, more than 100,000 of her opponents were arrested, and the press was strictly censored, which wasn't exactly the most democratic thing to do. The state of emergency lasted for nearly 2 years, and in that time we see the rise of Indira's son Sanjay Gandhi, who became a slightly controversial figure. Sanjay became notorious for the demolition of slums in major cities and starting a compulsory sterilisation program of young men to curb population growth. Perhaps Mrs. Gandhi thought that the emergency had gone too far, or perhaps she thought that she could legitimately win power again. But either way, everyone was completely taken by surprise when she lifted the state of emergency and elections were announced again in 1977. Both Indira and Sanjay lost their seats, and Morarji Desai became the first non-Congress Prime Minister of India. It didn't last long though, as Desai's Janata Party began to disintegrate, and in 1980, Indira Gandhi was back in business. But on the lighter side of things, in 1983, India won its first Cricket World Cup, and the sport absolutely skyrocketed in the country. And yeah, India loves its cricket. However, the following year, the country was again brought into crisis, this time in the state of Punjab. So Punjab is the only majority Sikh state in India, and in the early 1980s, some Sikh separatists started to demand their own Sikh nation, Khalistan. Some extremists armed themselves and took up residence in the Golden Temple in Amritsar, the holiest site in the Sikh religion. Negotiations with the militants failed, and in 1984, Indira Gandhi launched Operation Blue Star and attacked the separatists in the Golden Temple. Hundreds of people were killed, including innocent Sikh pilgrims, and many Sikhs saw this as an attack on the Holy Temple and an attack on their religion. 5 months later, Indira Gandhi was walking around in her residence in New Delhi when two of her own bodyguards, both Sikhs, fired on her and assassinated the Prime Minister. So after Indira's assassination, she was succeeded by her son, no, not Sanjay, her other son, Rajiv Gandhi. See, India may have been the world's largest democracy, but politics definitely had its favourite family. So when Rajiv Gandhi came in, there's a whole bunch of problems to fix. He had to send in the army to sort out the horrific anti-Sikh violence in Delhi, but there's also a few issues in the south. Okay, so Sri Lanka was going through a period of major instability. To briefly summarise, the two largest ethnic groups in Sri Lanka were the Sinhalese and the Tamils. Since Sri Lanka achieved independence, the Sinhalese government had implemented a few policies to squeeze out the Tamils, such as the burning of Tamil scripture and supporting anti-Tamil riots. India has a massive Tamil population, and when the Sri Lankan Civil War broke out in 1983 between the Tamil Tigers and the Sri Lankan states, there was a massive pressure for the Indian government to help the Tamils. So Rajiv Gandhi sent in an Indian peacekeeping force to end the civil war. But what ended up happening was a completely different story. The Sinhalese resented a foreign army coming in, and the Tamils were not happy that the peacekeeping force were disarming the Tigers. And soon a conflict started to emerge between the Tamil Tigers and the Indian peacekeeping force. It was basically a lose-lose situation, and getting sucked into this conflict in Sri Lanka, many even call it India's Vietnam War. Anyway, back at home, Rajiv Gandhi did a pretty great job in dealing with the drought of 1987, and he then started to open up the economy, notably bringing in a telecommunications revolution. But Rajiv Gandhi also had the title of Mr. Clean, aka he doesn't do anything shady. Well, when the Bofors and the Fairfax scandals started coming in, it looked like Rajiv may have been getting his hands dirty, and the government stank of corruption. Whether or not these allegations were true is another question, but Rajiv Gandhi ended up losing the 1989 election, and whilst campaigning in 1991, he was assassinated by a suicide bomber from the Tamil Tigers. In 1991, Narasimha Rao comes in, and with his finance minister Manmohan Singh, they wanted to change things. If you look at China, which actually started off in a very similar position to India, and pretty much remained identical in development until the 1980s, well, thanks to Deng Xiaoping's liberal economic reforms, China has skyrocketed past India, and with the fall of the Soviet Union, it became pretty clear that full guns-blazing free market policies was the future. India made a major shift away from Nehruvian socialism and started to cut government regulation and privatise industry. In the next few years, foreign investment into India started to rise, Indian industry began to develop, and a new middle class emerged. Successive governments will continue economic liberalisation, and although there's still a lot of work to be done, the larger India's economy becomes, the more powerful it will be on the world stage. Anyway, in the 90s we also see the rise of Hindu nationalism. In 1992, the Babri Masjid Mosque in Ayodhya was demolished by a Hindu mob. The story, according to them, was that the mosque was built on a pre-existing Hindu temple and the birthplace of the god Rama. Whilst for Muslims, they valued it because they believed that it was built by the founder of the Mughal Empire. In the aftermath of the demolition, communal riots took hold across the subcontinent and served as a pretense for the 1993 Bombay bombings. In the next few years, the pro-Hindu, right-wing Bharatiya Janata Party gained power, and in 1996, Vajpayee became the 10th Prime Minister of India. India officially joined the nuclear club by conducting nuclear fission explosions in the Pokhran Range in 1998. And luckily, none of these new weapons were used when India went to war again with Pakistan the following year. As you enter the 21st century, there's some clear problems facing India, such as hostile neighbours, rural-urban inequality, and corruption. But there are some major positives to take away, such as extreme poverty being wiped out at an extraordinary rate, and a wealthier Indian state being able to invest in infrastructure, education, and healthcare to improve the lives of ordinary people. That pretty much sums up the entire 20th century. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and be sure to subscribe to the channel if you did. The next country I'm going to cover may step on a fair few controversial topics. It's of course Germany. See you then.